But I'm going to go straight into introducing the panel because we've got an awful lot to get through today, and so you really don't need to hear too much from me. So we're delighted to have with us His Majesty's Ambassador to Japan, Julia Longbottom. Sorry, I'm old. I've been out of the UK a very long time. Second, we have Chris Hunt, who has a very long title. He's a Director for Trade and Investment in Japan, as well as being the Deputy Trade Commissioner for Northeast Asia. Dominic Sharman, partner at law firm Baker McKenzie and Deputy Chair of the UK-Japan Connect. You're very lucky. It's not often you get two Dominics. And Steve Norris, who's a partner at Control Risks. I'm going to ask each panelist to very briefly introduce themselves and give some brief opening remarks. I will then ask the ambassador to start today's discussion with some opening comments and give a macro overview of UK-Japan relations and the opportunities created by the new government's overall agenda. We're going to have 15 minutes of Q&A. I would expect that to start at about 9 o'clock. And then the room will be open till about 9:30, so please do stay around and network.
Morning, everyone. My name is Christopher Hunt. I'm, as Dominic said, got a very long title, so that involves a couple of hats. As Director for Trade and Investment here in Japan, I lead a team of about 50, split across the embassy in Tokyo and the Consulate General in Osaka. So trade is helping British companies do business in Japan, and investment, working with Japanese business to invest in the UK. The other hat is a regional role, which covers Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. So I sort of manage myself, I guess, as country director for Japan. Before starting this job in July, I was working in London, where I was working on trade policy, on free trade agreements, and representing the UK at the WTO. And then for about 18 years before then, I was a lawyer in private practice, working at a number of firms, Herbert Smith Freehills, White & Case, Hogan Lovells. And if you stitch together my time in Japan, starting with the JET program and then time working as a lawyer and now, stitched all together, it's about 15 years across 4 different stints. And then finally, and in a bit of shameless pandering, for 9 years, I was a very proud BCCJ member and would come to events like this. First time actually speaking at one of these events, so sort of a long-time listener, first-time caller sort of situation today. But I think one of the great things I've always enjoyed is that just looking out here, I can see former colleagues, former clients, people I've known a long time, people I've met recently, people I've not met before. And that's one of the great things. And so real pleasure to be here.
Morning, everyone. My name's Steve Norris. I'm working for Control Risks here in Tokyo. We're a British company. We have an office here, but our headquarters is in the UK. We do a lot of work for British and Japanese governments, but much more for the private sector. Usually, we're known as a company you might call when you're in trouble, but we do a lot more than that, and especially around advisory on how to get into new markets or to establish markets when there's a government change. So very, very much looking forward to covering some opportunity ground this morning as well. Thank you.
Thank you, fellow Dominic. I'm Dominic Sharman. I go by Dom, just to differentiate ourselves a little bit. Again, fairly long timer in Japan, around 10 years. I'm a partner at Baker McKenzie. And also the Deputy Chairman of UK-Japan Connect, which is represented here, but is a initiative that we have started in the past year, which focuses on cultural, business, and public and private sector collaboration and helping parties in both countries to connect. And yeah, thank you very much for the invite to speak.
Great, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with the BCCJ again. Julia Longbottom, British Ambassador to Japan. I first came to Japan in 1989 and knew at least one of you in the room at that time. And I've come back now for the 3rd time as ambassador. So in total, I've probably spent 12 to 13 years in Japan so far. and I expect to be here until around summer 26, so I've got a little longer to go. Dominic, you asked about the British government's overall relationship with Japan, I guess, in the post-Brexit context first, and then now with our new Labour government. So I arrived in March 21 as ambassador, and I think sometimes you forget the immediate history, but we'd clearly gone through the period from the Brexit referendum in 2016, the whole long years of negotiations to actually leave the EU, and the sort of shockwaves that sent through Japan and through the UK's partnership with Japan. And then, just as we thought we were sorting all of that out, we were hit by COVID. So actually, March 21 was a fantastic time to arrive in Japan as ambassador, because it was that opportunity to really sort of relaunch the relationship. And I think that's exactly how it's felt. The integrated review that the previous government, the Conservative government, launched at that point, with its clear commitment to the Indo-Pacific as the region with the greatest dynamic growth in the world, but also where security is challenged, but where there are many partners that share our values, first and foremost Japan in Northeast Asia, was a great message and a platform for us to rebuild the relationship. And I think if we look to last May, when the G7 summit was held in Hiroshima, then Prime Minister Sunak agreed a really impressive and ambitious set of strategic commitments with Japan in the form of the Hiroshima Accord, which set out the UK-Japan global strategic partnership, is what we called it. And I think, just to flag the key components of that, first, a very sort of significant set of commitments on security and defence. Second, on everything to do with growth and prosperity, including in a world that was increasingly challenged. If you think then we'd gone through Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which created quite a significant mindset shift in Japan, I think. But also, a world where China's influence is challenging all of us, but also challenging the values and the ways of thinking that we and Japan share. So security, economic and growth, and then the third element was to do with working together to tackle global challenges. And that sounds rather grand, but actually I think it's all relevant in this sort of geopolitical context where many things have become much more shaky than they were before, including, in the country that is the common ally to both of us, where elections are taking place before the end of the year, and where the UK and Japan really saw an opportunity to, and still see an opportunity to, have a positive influence in the way we work together on making sure that the international system remains open. We are both nations that rely on a free and open trading system in the world, and I think in some ways we share those values even more strongly than any other kind of combination of partners. But where we have an opportunity to help address climate change, it's support for international development in a way that is aligned with the values that we share, again, where some others don't do that, and where energy security and so on are increasingly challenged. So that was the situation at the point when the general election was called. I would still confidently say that the UK-Japan relationship is at its strongest ever. And now with the new government, we have every opportunity to build on that and take it even further. So Just very briefly, you've probably all heard them, and the Labour Party conference is underway at the moment. I can't possibly keep up with everything that's going on there, and we'll all find out what the fallout of that, or what the kind of direction is that comes out of that. But 5 missions fundamentally that the Prime Minister Keir Starmer has set out. But number 1 is growth, and there is a recognition that if you don't focus on growth, you can't do any of the other things that you want to do. And so growth, economic growth, will be the number 1 mantra. And clearly we share that goal with Japan. Number 2, they're probably not in the right order, but becoming a clean energy superpower. So moving to clean energy by 2030. The details will yet be, they'll all be worked through, but a very high level of ambition to shift and keep shifting to clean energy, and working with others to do the same. These are the 5 domestic missions. So the 3rd is keeping our streets safe, addressing crime, and including the violent disruptions that happened last month. 4th is equal opportunity for all. This is a Labour government. It cares about ensuring everybody has access to opportunity, to skills, to education. And finally, fixing the NHS, so the healthcare system. But there is a lot that we do as UK and Japan on life sciences and pharmaceuticals and so on. So a lot to play for there. So in terms of the UK-Japan relationship, we have many opportunities, particularly growth, economic growth, everything to do with economic security, technology, supply chains. We are working furiously with Japan on all of these issues. I think not least because there are so many uncertainties about other players in the world, and where sometimes the UK and Japan, as 2 trading nations off large continental blocks, now no longer the UK in the EU, actually we have some opportunities to do more together, particularly because, as I say, our interests and our ways of thinking are very aligned. So whether it's digital regulation, making sure that AI is both safe but also fully available to business and researchers to take advantage of, whether it's how we think about trade barriers, trying not to put up trade barriers all the time, but working out how we best allow trade to flow. And then on security, we will continue, I can say a bit more later, but we've come a very long way on defence, including the Global Combat Air Programme, but also increased joint exercising, trying to create a deterrent effect in the Indo-Pacific region, which I think is very important. And then on clean energy, there is an enormous agenda, and I think we'll come back to that later. So I better stop there, but thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. I learned more there than I would have listening to a 1-hour speech at the party conference. But thank you, Julia. Thank you, Ambassador. That sets things up very nicely. So let's move on. I'm going to ask Chris and Dominic some questions here, but I want to focus on trade, investment, and regulation. So Chris, starting with you. So generally, what is the UK government's plan for boosting economic growth? And that should set up for some following on questions.
Thanks very much, Dominic. As I was turning to Julia during our answer, I noticed the Prime Minister is watching us there, and
He's not got his glasses on.
And he was smiling, so I think so. This bodes well for this morning. So look, Julia mentioned the missions and in particular growth. Just to sort of delve into that one a little bit more, I think the approach of mission-led government is a little bit different. Instead of having like each department having like a sort of its own specific target, this is sort of a whole of HMG approach, everybody having a sort of a growth mindset, or a mindset towards boosting economic growth. And I think that it sort of allows, or the idea is that it allows a sort of a more holistic and innovative approach to some of the big challenges and long-term challenges. Now, how we turn this mission into action is sort of a product of many things. It starts off with some of the bills which were announced during the King's speech. There are about 40 of them in total. And they speak to what some of these priorities are going to be. So just to give a selection, which maybe we can delve into in a little bit more detail later, there are things like there's going to be an industrial strategy. We have had attempts at an industrial strategy. We've had different iterations of an industrial strategy before, but I think this one, I think it's fair to say, is much more sort of holistic, whole of government one, and that's going to be announced. The sectors that's going to cover are going to be announced next month, and then those sectors will be published in more detail with sector plans in the spring. We'll also, the government's also looking at the trade strategy. Since leaving the EU, we have many sort of free trade agreements and a number of other agreements in the trade space. But again, taking a fresh look at that and what are the levers that we can pull there to boost economic growth. Julia mentioned that there was one of the other missions, which I think is particular relevance to the UK-Japan relationship, is green energy superpower. And you can already see the sort of the base that we deal with there, given the relationship between the UK and Japan in things like offshore wind or electric vehicles and batteries and so on. And so some of the initiatives there would be things like creating a state-owned energy company, Great British Energy, based in Scotland, and also establishing a national wealth fund, which again is another first. That's the sort of the macro picture. But if you look at what about Japan specifically, the government has reaffirmed the Hiroshima Accord, which Julia mentioned and spoke about it in some depth. And there are a number of partnerships which are already in place from the Hiroshima Accord, which we're looking to build on still further, whether that is around elevating our science and technology relationship and digital and AI and on energy. It is I don't want to say status quo, but I would say that it is continuing the work that we're already doing, but with this sort of new lens that we have and with the new initiatives coming out of London, with those 40 bills as part of the King's speech and the different structures that have been set up.
Excellent, thanks. Dom, let me move to you. So in the post-Brexit environment then, what opportunities and challenges do British-based businesses face operating in Japan and vice versa?
Thanks for that. Look, I think a lot of the focus today, rightly so, will be on Japanese businesses going into the UK. However, just to touch on the opposite, basically, Japan, I think, in our combined relatively long time here, has become a more and more friendly place for foreign companies to operate. I think that's fair to say. And there is interest growing globally, not least from the UK, in how inbound investment and inbound operation might work. I think if we look at regional incentives, obviously Tokyo aside, Osaka, Fukuoka have really had a lot of focus and are offering good incentives for foreign businesses wanting to base themselves and operate there. And taking that aside as well, government incentives such as the double asset-based income plan as well means a lot for especially asset management companies who are wanting to come here and operate, which I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that's one of the DBT's focus areas. And lastly, modernising capital markets and an increased focus on corporate governance. And to basically to better serve shareholders and to modernise in that space. So that's a whistle-stop tour of Japan for the UK. So perhaps switching that. Julia made an incredibly good point, and one that is probably plain for everyone to see. The pace at which the Labour government have started after 14 years of waiting has been, I think you could fairly describe as breakneck. And to zoom out again, that doesn't show any particular signs of abating. If we look at it as what is planned to be a two-term government, and I think a lot of the planning is around that. To kind of zoom in, I guess again. Obviously, we have the SEPA already in place, and imminently CPTPP, which will mean a lot for the relationship and the opportunities between the parties. Just last week, I attended a great seminar which focused exactly on that for SMEs coming into Japan and the opportunities there. But if we go back to what Chris was talking about in the King's Speech, just to focus on a few areas there, which will be both opportunities and potentially challenges. The first, I think, overall, we're looking at a stronger and more regulation, but not in an invasive way, I think is a fair comment. And investment in key areas is likely to be heavily scrutinized, including digital and tech and also energy, as Chris was talking about as well. The first, and I guess a bit of a curveball, in terms of non-London-based businesses, might be the English Devolution Bill and how that might impact businesses working outside of London. So obviously you have, for example, Nissan up in Sunderland, and just to give one example. So that could present opportunities to have more conversations on a regional level. Potentially it could create some hurdles depending on how that conversation goes, but great potential there. The Employment Rights Bill, that this is going to likely increase employees' rights in the context of Japanese companies who are operating on the ground in the UK. However, I think it's again fair to say that taken against Japanese employment law, I think it's still not as employee friendly as Japanese employment laws. So I think the level of comfort there for Japanese companies is likely still high. The Great British Energy Bill, which Chris has already touched on a little bit. There's a lot of investment already and a lot of commitment from Japanese energy companies in the UK. Look at Marubeni and Scott Wind, for example. Look at JERA's relocation to London. There can only be opportunities presented by the Great British Energy Bill, in my view, including the allowing onshore wind again. Offshore wind is one area that is it presents a lot of potential in both Japan and the UK. However, in terms of turbine supply, other similar issues, onshore might be a little easier. And I think again, just to zoom out again, David Lammy has already stressed the importance of the Indo-Pacific and of Japan specifically. So I imagine that the opportunities will really be there for Japanese companies looking to be in the UK.
Great, thank you, Dom. And you went into a lot of detail there. Chris, is there anything you might want to add to that in terms of what the UK government's doing to ensure these opportunities are maximised, or did our colleague cover everything there?
Dom covered a lot of stuff there. I think just to sort of look at, we often get asked post-Brexit, how we sort of maximise these opportunities, and what does this mean, the new relationship between UK and Japan after EU exit. And I think just sort of the headlines there would be the free trade agreement between the UK and Japan, which is something which lowered tariffs and which made it easier to do business here for British companies. And it is a means through which we can pursue market access through the various committees as part of the SEPA, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. CPTPP, UK is going to be joining that as of the middle of December. That's going to give British business additional benefits above and beyond what we already have in the UK-Japan bilateral deal. I think sort of more broadly, when you think about post-EU exit, the UK has more regulatory freedom. Sometimes we may not wish to use that, like for instance in product safety. Business was said, actually, could you align with the EU? That would be helpful. We have. But there are other areas where it makes sense. for the UK to partner with like-mindeds like Japan when it comes to things like AI regulation, as Julia mentioned, or on data policy or things like that. Now, there's going to be a sort of a wider conversation the government will have about relations with the EU and what that could look like in the future. We often get asked, does this mean the UK is going to rejoin the EU? No. Are we going to rejoin the customs union? No. But it does mean taking a sort of a fresh look at it, and there could be some bespoke arrangements that could be negotiated there. And so I sort of, the final point I would mention is just on sort of trade strategy. Again, that's something we're looking at. There are various levers to pull there, but given the importance of the relationship between the UK and Japan, it's very much on the government's mind.
Excellent, thank you. Well, that was a subject we went into a lot of detail on, so I appreciate that. I think this is very important for the audience. So let's move on to a few more specific areas. So let's talk about the digital economy. So Chris, I'm sorry it's going to be you again, but first, Dom first. So looking at these sort of opportunities in the rapidly growing digital economy and the steps that BCCJ members can take to engage with the UK's tech landscape. So Dom, let me start with you. So what opportunities do you see for Japanese businesses to benefit from the UK's push towards this digital transformation? It's obviously AI, fintech, cybersecurity, the main areas.
Yeah, no, precisely right.
Yes,
And I
yes.
think those are the areas that are looked at most commonly. Look, I think Japan has been described, and I have to get my quote right, so that's why I look at my notes, as an open door for tech pioneers, right? Japan has its challenges with startups, which, as we spoke about before, seem to be moving in the right direction, and with more kind of global-based innovation as opposed to more Japan-focused. So in that way, this does present a lot of opportunities for British businesses. Now, it's a specific area in the Hiroshima Accord for focus, and I think that's rightly so. If you look at certain areas, renewables, so tech surrounding renewables, obviously, as we were talking about before about the Great British Energy Bill, that the focus on renewable energy and the tech needed in that particular area will necessarily feed back or present opportunities in Japan as well. And ultimately AI, if we look at obviously SoftBank and ARM being a good example of how that's working, quantum tech, engineering, they all present good opportunities. Now, the one thing that is very encouraging to see is the British government's own initiatives with the Japanese government to kind of demonstrate how to enter the market here and the like. So perhaps not necessarily on the massive corporation end, but on the SMEs and the startup end, that will make things easier for UK businesses wanting to make the most of those opportunities.
Thank you very much. So since we've established the government's focus on the digital economy, so question for you, Chris. How can Japanese companies, what practical steps can they take to sort of tap into what's happening in the UK in terms of digital economy?
Well, a very practical step, come and talk to us. So we have teams devoted to this subject and have worked with many British and Japanese companies here because, look, it is a great scene in the UK with the strength of the universities, R&D, the clusters, the incubators, the accelerators, and the whole ecosystem. So that's the very first step. Come and talk with us. There's lots of opportunities, whether it's at London Tech Week or on the fintech space and so on. There is, as I mentioned, this partnership that we have. There are 14 different areas in this digital partnership between the UK and Japan, and this is covering everything. AI, semiconductors, cross-border data flows, you name it. And so I think that expression one of my old bosses used to use was sort of suck it and see. I think is really it because I think the opportunities have never been greater. And I think that given I think there's a really interesting link here between the the future economy and AI and tech, and also with clean energy that we've spoken about as well. But it's also in things like healthcare and tech, and insurance and tech, and anything you like and tech. And so I think that when people think, oh, digital, it is just about, I don't know, an AI product. No, it's about everything. Everything is capable of that. And you can see it in some of the recent successes. You look at a British company like Second Mind working with Mazda to optimize engines, people like Ocado working with Aon for customer fulfillment centers, partnerships between Mind Foundry and insurance company Aoi Nisei Dowa, Daiichi Life and ULife. So many different examples that where companies have tried this across a wide range.
Thank you. So let's move on. Steve, you've been sitting very patiently. Thank you. So I'm going to bring your expertise in here. Let's move on to risk and uncertainty, and related to policy change, trade, regulation, and helping businesses navigate these issues. I mean, I guess I'd start with saying, from a risk perspective, what are the key uncertainties businesses need to prepare for with the UK's evolving policies?
Okay, yeah. Bring it down a bit. I'd say if you think about trade, probably the only risk you need to think about is setting your expectations correctly. Been in Asia now for a very long time, and ever since the Brexit referendum, with various degrees of kind of laughter, I've been getting questions about what are you doing, when are you going to go back in the EU, what's going to happen. Since the election, I'd say even now Japanese companies will still ask, yeah, but they're going back in, right? It's going to be a customs union. There's a plan. I'd say no, I don't think there is a plan. They're doing exactly what they said they're going to do, and they are setting their expectations quite low across the board, I would say. And on that one, I think you can definitely take them at their word. On to climate and regulation. Labour's got a massive majority. If they can maintain their confidence, they can continue to deliver. They've been very quick in getting a lot of regulation out the door, especially on climate and decarbonising the grid by 2030. Judging by the comments I've received from my colleagues in London, the new energy minister, Ed Miliband, he's a pretty divides the crowd, divisive figure. I'd say he's been put there because he's a big boy. He's former opposition leader, and he can take a lot of criticism. While to a lot of us that his agenda looks extremely ambitious and positive and growth generating. On the other side, a lot of the companies who operate in the UK already, the conversations they have with us in London are around: is he cutting too deep too quickly on some of our traditional industries, particularly in Scotland? That's kind of standard reaction you might hear from incumbents. The more nuanced will say, well, yeah, this is going to create losers, particularly on things like planning reform, local opposition. And I'd say that the risk is that the Labour government loses a bit of momentum, and they will. They will start to take criticism, take hits. Popularity will suffer. That's inevitable, whatever they do. And then will they be able to maintain their confidence and continue to go at the pace they're going? And even it doesn't have to fall off a lot for companies, including Japanese companies. And if you look at some of the big Japanese renewable companies who've walked away from big renewable projects in Japan, if they don't feel like they have a social license locally, it's very difficult, even if you have the regulatory support in place, to go ahead and to justify it to your shareholders. So I'd say the risk is that the Labour government, they lose a bit of momentum, and that's probably what you should be watching for and looking for localized reactions to what they're trying to do. I hope they get it right, and I think they've got a lot in their favour. The other thing that we'll talk about more, and which I'm going to use to seg into opportunities, is they don't have a lot of money, and they need to capitalize a lot of these things like GB Energy. And how are they going to do that?
Thank you. Very interesting. So let's, on a similar theme, but let's focus a bit more on the sort of legal and regulatory side. So Dom, so how can businesses in UK and Japan navigate the potential hurdles in the evolving legal and regulatory environment?
Thanks again for the question. Look, just going to one thing that Steve mentioned about the, almost the blessing and the curse of such a massive majority is keeping everyone happy, right? And that's something that will be, a challenge. But as you say, there's potential there for an impact. I think in short, there are so many resources available to people now, whether that is through advisory companies like Control Risks, whether that is through the government itself. You can't move for webinars these days, very insightful and interesting webinars, that's not to demean them, about really key areas about developments with the government. So I think that the biggest thing is for people to keep their ear to the ground. Okay. It's not that hard to do these days. I remember a time before the internet, but keeping your ear to the ground is a big point. A bit of a shameless plug for us at Baker McKenzie and for UK Japan Connect. We also have a lot of publications on this area, which are bilingual, to cover interesting news pieces, not just the law. And so I think if you have a good pragmatic legal counsel, if you have good advisors, and if you are always keeping your ear to the ground, then that should steer you right.
I won't further the plug. Okay, so both Julia and Steve have mentioned climate change, sustainability. So let's focus a bit on that. It's one of the key priorities of both the governments. Let's face it. So let's focus on sort of how businesses can seize the opportunities in this developing green economy. So, Steve, let me ask you first. So, what opportunities do you see for businesses in addressing sustainability and climate change challenges, especially given the new agenda out of the UK?
Well, we do a lot of work for Japanese companies in Southeast Asia, and a lot of what they're doing there is taking their technologies that are not strictly speaking renewables, but are related to transitioning old infrastructure into a lower emission or clean footing. And in some ways, that's a strategy that they might be able to take to the UK if they do it if they package it a bit more carefully than they do in Southeast Asia, shall we say? So that's the first one that springs to mind. Um, the second question I get asked all the time by Japanese companies, wherever they're going, including the UK, is what do they think about China? How do they compare China and Japan? And recently, there's been nothing more important in that context than what will that government do about Chinese EVs. If you talk to the Chinese EV companies, they are very, very confident that they're going to be all over the UK within the next 2 to 3 years. So I suppose that's going to be a source of alarm if that happens for Japanese companies. They'll see that as, oh no. Um, but really, what that does is that creates quite a lot of opportunities. Maybe not for the Japanese auto companies who have their own story on EVs, but for the infrastructure that comes along with it. So if you talk to some of the Japanese companies who are involved in, like say, charging infrastructure, grid transmission, grid management, allocation of flexible pricing models, they have a lot to potentially offer the UK there if they can get over their kind of China shock. So that's one way in which we're kind of encouraging them to keep their minds open to the UK. And if you have the opportunity to have those discussions with Japanese companies, I would definitely recommend they do that. There's a lot downstream going on, obviously here and in the UK, and they're very interested in what we've done with offshore wind in Scotland, and they're trying to do some of that here. Obviously, they're earlier in the process than us. There's a lot that I think that we could cooperate with on that front as well. I mean, it's difficult because, as I said, the government is probably going to struggle to capitalize a lot of these things, and the offshore wind companies, they're already in quite a lot of distress. So finding a way through that is going to be important. I think one more that I'll throw out because it's a weird one, and the first time I got asked it by a Japanese company, a very big Japanese company, I had to quickly go off and Google it. But there's a lot of knowledge in Japan about the critical minerals we have down in Cornwall, apparently under the ground. And I did look it up, and there's a lithium company down there. And just a couple of weeks ago, Angela Rayner gave them a special priority designation. Um, that is something that the Japanese, they're scouring the world for those kinds of things, and they're going into places they don't really want to be. They're all over their own seabed offshore Japan as well. I can imagine a massive lithium deposit in Cornwall would be something that would be very, very interesting for the UK. And it will be a great test to see if we get our planning reform up and running, as we say we will.
That's a fascinating answer. But firstly, let me congratulate you on the first part of your answer. Very diplomatic. I thought we only had one master diplomat on this stage, but yeah. So Julia, let me turn to you, if I may. So what strategies will the UK government employ to encourage deeper business engagement with the green economy between Japan and...
Thanks very much. I will have not a bad word said about Ed Miliband. I saw him in action 10 days ago in London talking to collected British ambassadors from around the world back for a conference. And he is genuinely excited to be able to have a second go at a job that he's very passionate about. But I think what's interesting is that he was really emphasizing energy security, or the importance of access to energy and bringing people's bills down. So he was clear that it's harder to win the argument talking about climate change, and much more important to talk about things closer to to the public's hearts. I think so. In terms of the UK and Japan, it's true to say that Japan has been a little bit slower coming to this party, but there is an awful lot that the British government has done in partnership with the Japanese government to engage on and grow the market really in both countries for renewable energy. The amount of investment by Japanese companies into the UK's offshore wind sector in particular, but also in CCUS, increasing interest in hydrogen, for example. If you have a lot of clean, cheaper energy, you can produce hydrogen. Japan is very fixated on access to hydrogen and ammonia in particular, but is going to find it very hard in the short term to produce any volume because of the lack of available clean energy in Japan. So there's a real basis for a strong partnership. As Chris mentioned, under the UK-Japan Free Trade Agreement, the CEPA, we've set up subcommittees, not to sort of have arguments and beat each other up about market access, but to say, look, there's this issue, how together can we work to solve it for the benefit of both countries? And renewable energy is one of those subcommittees, or wind energy actually. And some of you might know we've brought businesses into that conversation, UK and Japanese businesses, to talk about how the UK has gone about shifting from 40% reliance on coal in 2012 to zero pretty much today. And that's all been through the development of offshore wind. In the UK, I often say we're very down on ourselves. We're very negative about our country. It's kind of national characteristic, isn't it? But we forget actually how good we are at some things. The UK is now using 51% renewables in its energy mix. So, we've come a very long way, and we're still going in that direction. And the ambition of the government, including the focus on place, or the different regions. Much of this development is happening in Scotland and Wales, Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland has done a lot on fixed on Rickajaw, not offshore but land-based wind energy already, and hasn't even started developing its seabed. So through these conversations, for example, we have shared with the Japanese government the UK's regulatory framework, the way we've incentivized offshore wind development, and the Japanese government has now adopted pretty much 100% the UK's contracts for difference framework for its next set of offshore wind auctions. So there is an enormous amount that we are doing together, and where there are opportunities both for Japanese companies into the UK still, but I see this sector as the one where, for the first time in decades, actually, I've seen more UK businesses coming to Japan and wanting to get involved in the Japanese market. So I think there's a real opportunity. Just a couple more quick things. There is also an opportunity in third countries. So ideally, the UK and Japan together will be and are starting to promote the adoption of renewable energy through our development programs, but also through supporting commercial initiatives. We have an MOU that we signed with JBIC, for example, and you all know how powerful JBIC is when it comes to these sorts of projects. And they've invited UK experts to come to Southeast Asia to talk about green grids with JBIC money. So we're sort of breaking in to the enormous assets that Japan is putting into economic development in third countries, Southeast Asia, but elsewhere as well. And I think there's an awful lot that we're going to be doing together. And then finally, on things like critical minerals, new technologies, and so on, what's interesting in Japan is how the debate is suddenly shifting, though it may depend a bit on who's selected on Friday as the next prime minister, because certainly one or two are suggesting Japan should go backwards on renewable energy, which wouldn't be great. But there's real potential to do more. But the debate in Japan has noticed that with increasing use of AI and new technologies and enormous fabs for semiconductors, the demand for clean energy is going up dramatically, and the demand from business for clean energy is increasing. So I think we have a real opportunity to do more together, as well as how we work on the technologies that support development of renewables. Thank you.
No, thank you. So let's zoom out just to finish up this panel discussion, which I thought has been extremely insight, very, very clear. Thank you. So Julia and Chris, I'm going to ask you to wrap this up, talk about the future outlook and business engagement. So please take these questions as you will. I don't mind who answers which, but I'm sure you guys have spoken together many times. So, so looking forward then, what are the key factors that will shape the UK-Japan business relationship in the coming years? And following on from that, so what strategies will the UK government employ to encourage deeper business engagement between the UK and Japan? Who wants to go first? You've got 3 minutes maximum.
Okay, thanks very much, Dominic. So, I mean, what I've said to this to the BCCJ before is that our job as representatives of the British government in Japan is in large part to sort of float the relationship ever higher, to help the Japanese government, but Japanese companies see just how close our relationship is in order to support and incentivize even greater collaboration in the business world. We've talked about sort of key areas where we're doing that: defense, decarbonisation, and sort of digital and advanced technologies writ large. We will be hearing soon what the industrial strategy determines are the key sectors for the focus in the UK, but I'm absolutely confident they will map really well onto business interests in and with Japan. So whether that's advanced manufacturing, AI and technology, life sciences, defense, renewables, financial services, I fully expect they will all be in there. And all of the work that we do through government to government agreements, and we have a lot now. We're working very, very closely with METI, who are really interested in working with us on policy development, as well as looking at trade and how we do that together. So I think there are going to be enormous opportunities. It's our job to support business, both UK businesses coming to Japan and operating here, but also Japanese business going into the UK. I think the opportunities are going to be enormous.
Nothing to add? She's the expert. Well, on that note, we're going to move to Q&A, but before we go to the Q&A, thank you very much, all of you, for your comments. So how do we do? Are there mics running around? There are mics running around the room, so please put your hand up and wait for a mic to come your way.
Thank you very much. Great panel, great input. Thank you so much, Ambassador. I'm Ken Katayama, individual member of the BCCJ, also executive committee member like Richard, Heather, and Tomita-san. I hope I haven't missed anybody else. My question, the ambassador mentioned it a little bit, but maybe this is a question more for somebody who's not with the British government, so probably for Dom or Steve. I don't think anybody really mentioned anything about our country. We have a new leader of the opposition party as of Monday. Coming Friday, we'll have a new leader of the Liberal Democratic Party who will be our prime minister. It's very likely that an election would be called, depending on who the prime minister is, this year, and definitely next year. So from the UK, how is everybody looking at these politics? I mean, in my day job, I have to do risk management, so obviously I have to look about who's going to be the new president of the United States and things like that. So how is the British are looking at the Japanese political situation?
Who wants the hot potato?
Ambassador, I saw you nodding, but if you want to answer that one, you're welcome to nod.
All I would say is it's an inconvenient truth of democracy that we have elections, but it makes our lives very exciting to work out how we manage through them.
But then Steve or Dom, thank you.
I mean, I doubt they're overly across the detail of the different candidates or overly worried. I think they're pretty confident that Japan is a firm and reliable ally, and seen so many Japanese prime ministers since been covering Japan, and none of them have hugely affected the bilateral relationship. I think they should be a little bit more concerned if we're talking about business cooperation for the reason the ambassador said. A couple of them are quite regressive on policy. I imagine the best case outcome for them would be the Koizumi Jr. or Konotaro. So they might not know it yet, but that's what they should be hoping for.
Yeah, not a drastic amount to add, but again, it's been interesting to see the comparative lack of interest from the UK direction into Japan as to the new PM. I think there is still that thing of, well, does it really make a difference? I think the answer is possibly, and for reasons Steve mentioned on some key areas, it could. However, again, just to echo what Steve said, and take the easy way out, I think the bilateral relationship is incredibly strong, and I think it's unlikely to take a big hit, regardless whoever the next PM is. Not to say that we shouldn't consider what the impacts are once we have a bit more visibility on the area.
Any other questions? Yes.
James and Paul Singh from the BCC XCOM as well. Yes, if I can. Someone mentioned money. So if we have to plug the UK as an option to, say, have a huge investment project, one of the concerns might be the lack of infrastructure and funding for that. So what could we say to Japanese clients, for example, to kind of promote the UK in that sense?
Thanks very much, James. So look, one of the things the government has said is that instead of crowding out investment, they want to crowd in investment. And what that means is by using public funds to attract more private capital into things like infrastructure. So if you use an example of the National Wealth Fund, that is being capitalized, and that is going to focus a lot on infrastructure, on things like ports and manufacturing capacity and things like that. So I think the answer is the government recognizes that. The government recognizes the importance of foreign investment and the fact that we need to attract private capital, but we're putting money on the table to help that along. So I think that would be like the sort of the headline message.
David Syred, AKI. We're talking about investment in infrastructure and the inconvenience of elections, changes of politicians, etc. I imagine that the truncation of the high-speed rail infrastructure had a somewhat negative effect on the impression in Japan of our ability to deliver these big projects. How do you think the Labour Party or the government in general could turn that impression around?
Look, good question. I think really it's just sort of in the government's engagement with investors and through their actions. I mean, the decision was made about HS2 and sort of the northern leg. There's a sort of an extra decision coming up about where exactly the terminus is going to be in London. There's going to be a decision on that soon. But I think it is really what steps does the government take to make good on the words on planning? And it's something that you hear a lot from investors is, okay, how are we going to be able to actually get stuff done? And so I think it's showing evidence that we're doing that. So to give you an example, day one, overturning regulation on onshore wind, it was practically impossible beforehand to get onshore wind in the UK. On the first day, the regulation was turned on its head as part of an effort to double onshore wind production by 2030. So I think it's just going to have to be, this is the intention of the government and backed up by evidence. I don't think there is a magic wand. It's just the hard work that comes from that.
I guess just to circle back to the legal point and the King's speech and really to say that what Chris is saying is totally right and is supported by the legislation. So if we look at the again that speed to start things off, ultimately the backing is there and will be there from a regulatory and legal standpoint. However, again, actions speak louder than words, and this first 100 days, I think, has given us massively positive signs as to what those actions will be.
Any other questions? In the back there, please.
Well, Kanako Fujisawa from PwC Japan. Thank you for today's presentations and opinions. And I have one question about the opportunity for the cooperation to cope with China, because speakers told much about the cooperation in the sector of renewable energy, hydrogen, and CCUS. But I think there is a risk of excessive production of China or any other type of economic coercion from China. And the main target is the products related to the renewable energy, like solar PV or wind turbines. Do you think there are any opportunities for the Japan and the UK companies to tackle with or to prevent the economic coercion or the power of excessive production by China?
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. One of the things that the Labour government has made very clear is that how we engage with China, the relationship we have with China, is very important. We've announced an audit of our relations with China, which, to be clear, doesn't mean a review of our policy or strategy. It means we need to be better at implementing the strategy that we've got. You might have seen already that the Prime Minister has spoken to Xi Jinping, and there's talk of the Foreign Secretary visiting China, because it really matters that we are engaging and talking, because China's influence is so significant on all of our interests. So there are, of course, where economic coercion is occurring, the UK and Japan are working together. There's the whole G7 economic coercion group, and we will be very serious partners in that. But I think we'll also want to be clear what is and what isn't economic coercion. And China's impact in the world of renewable technologies is significant, and we need to work out where that impact can be put to good use, and where it might damage competition or a level playing field. So I think we've yet to work out in specific areas how we go about this, but I would say that the UK and Japan probably share a similar position in terms of a strong instinct to keep the free and open trading system moving, and we are less inclined to immediately move to put up severe barriers, and we're going to need to negotiate through or navigate through different opinions of other key partners, including the US and the EU, to come to the right place. But the UK has benefited from China's supply chain for offshore wind and renewable energy. We decided to start fast and then develop our supply chain. Now there's a lot more emphasis on supply chain development in the UK for wind. I think we wouldn't have started if we decided to grow our own supply chain before we developed offshore wind. So, these are real choices that countries have to make. Thanks.
Well, I think right on time. That's it. Well, firstly, so thank you very much to all of you for attending today. I hope you found that enlightening and useful. And special thanks to the panel, Julia, Chris, Steve, Dom. Thank you very much indeed. And here we close it.